Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good evening, everyone. For those who I don't know, my name is Krishna Patel, and I have the privilege of being one of the trustees here at the Westport Library. Tonight, I have the extraordinary honor of introducing what I think is going to be just a wonderful conversation. Our celebrated author, Eiren Caffall, who's going to be in conversation with our returning guest to the library, Catherine Shen. And for those of you who may not yet have the book, All the Water in the World, there are copies that are available for sale. And at the end of the evening, Eiren is kindly going to be engaging in some book signings for us. So for those of you who've had the chance to read what is truly a beautiful story, for me personally, it is a story that moves so fluidly between the intimate, human connection, the importance of community, caring for each other during very uncertain and difficult times, and the immense, right? The enormity of an environmental collapse, a climate collapse, but also the fractionalization and the disintegration of society. One, I would be remiss, one of the most beautiful themes throughout this book is really honoring those who curate and catalog memory and stories, beauty and art, the essence of culture, particularly in a collapsing society. And it is the work that many do in our society, but is done by libraries and librarians. And I think it's such a beautiful way that it is honored in this book. The book really speaks to the vulnerability in very, very difficult times, being challenged by very dark forces. And certainly it speaks to having to live in a time of a lot of fragility, both for our planet and our society. I cannot think of a more relevant, important conversation to have. On behalf of our entire library, we are so deeply grateful for Eiren, not just for this incredible work, but for the time that she will share with us tonight. So please join me in welcoming Eiren Caffall and Catherine Shen.
Full-service radio talk show host you have here tonight. Thanks for coming, everyone. How's everyone doing? Okay, that's really enthusiastic. How are you all doing tonight? Okay, that is so much better. That's also a much funner way, funner is a word, to sound check and make sure you all can hear us. Everyone can hear us? Great.
An excellent choice.
Yeah. Do you have a random thought that you would like to share with the audience while I get myself together here? Because
I just want to say what a beautiful introduction that was, and overwhelming. And also, yes, I feel like that theme that Krishna brought up at the very end about how relevant it feels to talk about this book in this incredible palace of library science, community building, protection, and preservation is really, it's just been striking me the whole afternoon while I've been privileged to get to see this beautiful space and meet your librarians.
Well, spoiler alert, we're going to be talking about that tonight. I just want to get a quick check. How many of you have read the book already?
Wow.
Wow. Okay, we have a room of overachievers.
My heart.
But I'm going to try to make this as spoiler-free as possible, because I want to respect those who have not. But also apologies in advance if we, tiptoe a little bit around that, because there's so many things we want to talk about tonight. And speaking of which, you will all have a chance to ask questions towards the end. So we will talk for about 24 hours, right?
Yeah, we're going to have a sleepover.
At the 25th
Everyone's okay
hour,
with that, right?
You'll get a chance. So good luck, everyone.
Great.
So I thought I would just start with, I know we both have so many squirrel thoughts happening
Yes,
right now
so
about
many.
this book and beyond, but to sort of center us,
Okay.
tell us about the book and some of the characters that readers will be following.
So this book is a book about a group of people who have chosen to stay behind after the glaciers have all melted in a sort of collapsed New York City, where the city itself is protected by a large number of seawalls, and so is sort of a dry bowl in the middle of an encroaching ocean. And they've chosen to do this because, like so many curators across time, they feel that they have a duty to the museum that they swore to work for and protect. And they've stayed behind to protect collections, to protect each other, and to honor that job. And then an enormous storm comes, breaks the seawalls, and they have to look for escape by taking a canoe up the Hudson River. So it's a big adventure story with a lot of science and thoughts about community baked into it. And the characters that I've put in this space, the person we're mostly spending time with is Noni, who is, at the time of the telling, probably 18 or so, and 13 at the time of the events, who's trying to explain what it was like to grow up knowing very little else other than a collapsed world, and what happened to her parents and her sister and the community, the sort of chosen family that was made from these people who stayed behind doing this duty. And a large part of it was based on what I got obsessed with at a certain point as a museum nerd and as the daughter of a scientist, which was what happens after collapse happens to the people who protect museums, who protect scientific knowledge. It was largely based on things that happened during the Iraq War, where Iraqi curators came back during the bombardment of Baghdad to protect their antiquities in their museum, and also the siege of Leningrad, where for 3 years the curators that were part of the Hermitage stayed behind in a freezing cold museum, eating restorer's paste and chipping ice off of the masterpieces. And I kind of wanted to tell a story like that we really do have a huge portion of our community that stays behind to make things safe and to preserve things for a future that they can imagine.
And then the novel does open up where we learn that a family is living on the roof on the top of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and I mean, you kind of answered part of the question, but I would love to get deeper into that in terms of when I realized it was a museum, I was like, cool. I mean, I don't love what's happening to them, but I love the idea that they're living in a museum, because I did have this image. I've been there before, really fun and cool space, but I had this image that came right at me that was this juxtaposition of they're in a space with things that are being preserved versus things that are about to be preserved or perhaps lost forever, with the context of what's going on with the story. How much intentionality did you have building that? Or am I just going crazy?
No, you're not going crazy.
And having this crisis by myself?
No, you're not going crazy. I mean, part of it, I really did want to spend time in a space that is recognizably about the former world to most people. Most folks, generally a natural history museum only has about between 5 and 10% of its collections on display. And mostly what that means is that we see a lot of amazing dinosaur skeletons and, you know, the great blue whale at the Museum of Natural History in New York. But behind the scenes, there is a real sense of what is our duty to what could be lost and how do we preserve it? How do we make networks of communication and conversation that preserve the information in these artifacts? And how do we expand what that conversation looks like in terms of museum science? And I was writing this as a person who was spending a lot of time, my kid was obsessed with the Field Museum in Chicago, and just as I had been obsessed with the American Museum of Natural History in New York when I was a kid. So I was spending a lot of time going with my kid to this beautiful space, going behind the scenes and seeing the way that people thought about preservation. And also we're in a moment where there's an enormous reckoning with how do we think about artifacts? How do we be in conversation with the communities that produced them? There's a big change that happened while I was writing the book, which was when I started writing it, the sections of the American Museum of Natural History that dealt with indigenous artifacts were all open, and as the book was coming out, they finally closed them in order to be able to go and reassess the museum's holdings and return objects that needed to go back to where they belonged, where they'd come from. And so that was happening at the same time. So I wanted to talk about this moment of collapse as a mirror for the way that we talk about what we need to hold on to and how we want to form ourselves generally in the larger state of the world. What do we hold on to? What are our responsibilities to other people, and what things can we transition to the new world that we're trying to build?
And we'll definitely talk more about what do we hold on to when we go through so much hard times and chaos and whatnots. And I would love to learn more about, I think you've been working on this novel for a little bit. The idea has been germinating for a long time.
For a minute.
And just a quick minute. And
10 years, nothing big, it's fine.
I mean, what's time? It's not real. And I would love to know, when and where can you take us to that moment where you decided that you wanted to explore a futuristic dystopian novel, especially after just coming off of writing a memoir, The Mourner's Bestiary, and both of them grapple with very different, but I think there's some parallels in terms of catastrophes that your characters and yourself are facing. Yeah,
absolutely. And what's interesting is that I was writing both of them almost simultaneously. I'd finish a draft of one of the books, the nonfiction book that I was working on about ocean collapse, and then I would take time to write the fiction. But the book itself, the novel itself, was really born from this kind of what felt like a very dystopian moment in my own life. And I came to it pretty honestly. My mother was a scientist for the EPA in Massachusetts, so I was really steeped in thinking about science of collapse and what was happening with our water ecosystems. She was a hydrogeologist, and we watched a lot of disaster movies for fun, especially ones where the scientists were the heroes. Like, she loved to sit down with a terrible, trashy disaster movie and tell me all the geology they were getting wrong, and that's not how pyroclastic flow works. So I sort of came into that space very naturally, and in my own family of origin, which I think you're referring to, my father's side of the family has an incurable genetic disease, which I inherited. And we've had it for 150 years of our family life. And almost until my dad's generation, nobody lived past 50. So I was diagnosed with this when I was in my 20s. And you can see from that I might be the kind of young person who is really drawn to reading a lot of books about shipwrecks. That was definitely where my mind was going to go. It's very relaxing to me to think about catastrophe because it's sort of steeped into my biography. But I was a vulnerable person with this illness, which I did inherit, and I do have, and still, contend with today. I was a single mom. I was working multiple jobs as a writer, working on textbooks, and Superstorm Sandy came when I had a very small child and was going through sort of a bad part of my divorce. And my kid didn't sleep very well, and so we would fall asleep. And one night he was falling asleep, and I got a call from my godfather, who lived in Brooklyn, still does. His daughter had a house in Red Hook, and he had just come out of her basement where he had been trying to get all the seawater out of her basement with a sump pump for many hours. And he said, it was crazy. I was walking home, and all of the streets were like black ice because all of the oil from various drums that had gotten attacked by the seawater in Hurricane Sandy were suddenly all over the ground, and I had to be careful so that I wouldn't slip. And that detail was so specific and so direct and so much about a place that I love very deeply because I was born in New York, my family was from there, that I briefly fell back asleep, and when I woke back up again, Noni's voice was in my head, trying to talk to me about what it was like to live through this end of her world. It felt like all of the work I'd done as a journalist to try to explain how difficult the coming crises were going to be for us environmentally paled in front of that detail that my godfather gave me of, this is my lived experience. I love my daughter, I love my daughter's house. This horrible storm has come, and I don't know what to do with myself except to tell you that this is what it feels like just to walk my streets to come home. And that's how it started. And it only took me 10 years to get it right.
So we're gonna all marinate that in a little bit, and we all have different ways to relax. You watch disaster movies.
I do.
I also watch Chinese dramas and Korean dramas that rip my heart apart. So turns out we're both looking at the same thing.
This is why we're...
Well, you touched on this just now, but I think one thing that strikes me having conversations with different writers or artists or just any creators, I think it's really it makes sense that when we're storytelling, it's natural for us to sort of dig into our own personal histories, whether it's 150 years ago or maybe just yesterday. So how much of this did you think of when you were building your novel that you were going to pour yourself into, especially since you published a memoir?
Yeah.
So I imagine that's a little bit different. You are literally telling your own personal story and showing the world. You're being very vulnerable and raw in front of an audience of readers. But fiction could work differently. You don't have to do that. But it sounds like you probably did.
I sort of can't avoid it, much as I might try. I think that the gift of fiction, and I guess I did this a bit with my nonfiction as well, but the great gift of writing a novel for me was that I could put a family that wasn't my family into a place of great peril and fearfulness, and I could see what happened to them. I could give them different resources and different community and different experiences than my own family and see how that changed their trajectory, borrowing on, emotional truths that were from my own life. But also with a novel, one of the things that I don't think I felt permission to do when I was just thinking of myself as a nonfiction writer was that I could just put in whatever I loved. And I love that museum. I love it. And I've loved it since I was tiny. And I love the Hudson River in a deep way that is born from having taken the Amtrak from the Berkshires to New York City all the time when I was a young person. I love the places that they end up. I love the Berkshires, which is where they're going, which is where I was raised. And every time that I was placing people in peril or dredging up something that I understood about grief, because you can't live with a family that is facing an incurable illness without thinking a lot about loss. And every time that I was touching down into that and trying to find those stories and honor the people who I've lost in these fictional lives, I also was able to then alleviate that pain a little bit by reaching for something that I loved, something that I wanted to protect, or something I wanted to tell people about. My family's the kind of nerds that if you met us, let's say at the Field Museum on a member night, we would just talk your ear off about how great it's going to be to go see the ants. That exhibit is fantastic, and you got to go up there. And if you go now, you're going to be there before the line. And being a fiction writer is being able to do that, but for all the things that I was really obsessed with, every little nerdy hyper-focus I've ever had, I could be like, did you know that when ancient beavers used to make their underground layers, they're called paleocasters, and wait, they're spiraled. And I could throw that into the book in a way that it would bring some of the things that I find joyful and important and kind into what otherwise would just be an examination of a lot of hurt.
Well, I'm one of those people that will read the place card thing word from word. So if you're coming with me to the museum, good luck. I hope there's a cafe there because I will be there all day. So I feel like
we would go together. We would have a good time.
Yeah. And so back to the novel, you mentioned Noni, who is your main character.
Yeah.
And she was 13, right, when things
During
were
the action
happening.
of the
So
book.
Noni, this 13-year-old girl who's only really known trauma and ongoing destruction and death her whole life, which one of the things that I sort of read from her character is it really sadly mirrors a lot of the youth today.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that draws me into the novel too is it's almost a little too real sometimes.
Yeah.
And so because I had that in my mind, I'm curious to hear how much of the youth were you thinking? And when I say youth, of course, currently thinking about contemporary youth, but it could also be any one of us because we were all young. We're all young at some point. We've all been going through things at whatever point generationally and in present day.
Yeah.
So how much of that were you thinking in terms of wanting to show that young people are going through a lot?
Yeah.
They can take a lot. They're very resilient, but at some point, they're either going to break or want to give up, and I don't think anyone can really blame them.
No, absolutely not. And I think, again, I'm going to go back to my own family, which is that if you are anticipating that you're not going to live to an ripe old age, you start thinking pretty early about what it is, especially if you want to be a parent. And I did want to be a parent. And I value my relationship with my kid enormously. And there's always the sense in the back of your head that you might not be able to give them all the things and all the information that you would want to. You're maybe not going to get to, my father didn't get to come to my wedding, for example, and I know there was material and information and history that he wanted to hand me, and he handed me a lot, right? We definitely have this real tradition in my family of like putting everything into the baton and handing it off to the next generation as they get ready to move on to the next, knowing that you're going to be leaving your children with the trauma of your illness and maybe your death, right? That's a very weird way to move through the world. I don't think most of us know in the back of our heads that that could happen or that it might happen, and we have our family traditions, but it's very front of mind when you're diagnosed at a young age. And so I absolutely, in all of my books, have this sense of what am I going to be leaving behind so that if my child doesn't know me when they're 40, they will be able to get to know me and what I thought and what I felt was most important through what I've written down and left behind. And that impulse felt so germane to what we're trying to do now as crises accelerate within this modern moment. And I was starting this book before the pandemic had even happened. So I had this sense of like, this generation is growing up under this huge, the generation of my child, which is Gen Z, growing up under this huge shadow of the crisis of the climate. They'll never be able to experience what I experienced, which was growing up under, okay, there's an environmental collapse, things are terrible, but this existential threat was not part of my childhood. And I had a very actively engaged childhood thinking about environmental issues. Knowing that that was there, I wanted to write something that if I were not there to say to my kid, this is how we go forward. This is what we hold on to. This is why there's hope. This is why we don't give up when somebody tells us that the statistics and the odds are very dark. I wanted to be able to do that for him. And post-pandemic, I feel like it's even more important for that generation and for the generations coming up afterwards, because there's been a fundamental rupture in that sense of safety. And no matter how you spent the pandemic and no matter how you're spending this period of real darkness in American culture, you're living through a deep level of trauma that I don't think we even really know how to talk about yet in terms of its psychological impact on the next generation. And it was a big flex to write a character that had been through that much trauma, because while I know what that feels like in my own body and I know what it feels like in my inner dialogue, my inner monologue, I didn't know how to write it in such a way that it would draw people in instead of pushing them out. Because if you say to your publisher, your editor, your agent, I'm going to write a whole novel in the voice of a deeply traumatized 13-year-old girl who doesn't really talk a lot and is obsessed with prehistoric animals no one's heard of. How does that sound? Does that sound great?
Great. I love it.
Great.
Yes.
So it took me multiple iterations to figure out how I could write that and have something that felt like an authentic representation of trauma, but also still invite in the reader to feel like they could connect with Noni and identify with her as she went through what she did.
Well, and actually, as you're sort of talking our way through the process, I was thinking and imagining myself sort of flipping the pages. I wonder if it was helpful for those of you who read the novel, is we're seeing the story from Noni's perspective, but we're also going back and forth between her in the present day and her kind of going back to her mother's memories. And this is something that we discover very, very, very early in the novel, that her mother's no longer with her. So how did you come into that idea that you're going to do a sort of back and forth storytelling style?
You know, it took multiple iterations of the book before I really had that kind of dialed in. I knew pretty much from the beginning of the writing and beginning of meeting the character that her mother was gone. And I knew that because of all of the things that I'm talking about in terms of my own family, it was really important to me to write a book about a possibly dark future where there were people who were disabled and chronically ill, and there were other issues that people had to contend with, not just the sort of zombie apocalypse version of like, everything is dark, 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 right? I wanted there to be a recognizable reality because disabled people and chronically ill people exist across all time. And so I knew that I wanted that there, and I knew that I wanted to make sure that even with the mother being gone, that she was still really present, because my people are still very present for me. I'm here in a place where I'm a few miles away from the beach where I grew up swimming with my mom, and my mom is no longer with me, and yet she feels like she's been with me from the moment the plane touched down. So I wanted that to be present for her, and every time I wrote a chapter in the initial drafts, there were those memories sort of laced throughout. The innovation for me, and it's not a unique storytelling method, was to create this back and forth between the present moment and the past moment for a large part of the novel, and then to kind of ease us out of the past and just stay with the present, moving us forward in momentum, because this is a group of people that really collects information, and I wanted that backstory to be just as important as the kind of propulsive situation that they found themselves in at the moment of the action of the book.
Well, and another character that really struck me was that this is not a conventional character, because I see water as one.
That's good.
And I think similar, thanks, makes me feel so much more smarter than I am. But water jumped out to me because I wish I can pinpoint the exact moment, but I was just thinking very much like human beings as characters, where water and human beings are so multifaceted. And it can be, and I think early in the novel it's presented as this beautiful, calming, tranquil body of water, you know, the sea, the ocean. I think when we're meditating, we put on ocean waves. But we quickly learn that it is also devastating and destructive and menacing. So I want to come back to your intentionality. Did you think deeply about wanting water to be presented that way, or did it come naturally as you're writing the story?
That's such a good question. I think that with water, as with in my nonfiction book, More Than Human Creatures, I really wanted to be able to try as much as possible from my white Western, born in 1970 perspective, or 71 perspective, to start to find the truth of the experience of something that I didn't understand in my bones. I'm not water. I love water. I feel really connected to water. But I think we have, especially in books that are disaster books or narratives about disaster, we have this tendency to demonize the thing that's interrupting our lives, right? We demonize the storm, we demonize the flood, we demonize the wildfire, and all of these natural forces we could have a non-adversarial relationship with and still take in the truth of how complex and potentially dangerous they are. And I think we don't, in our culture, very often talk about it that way. It's either like a placid time at the lake, but that's just a non-existing non-entity that just is there for our pleasure, or we have these horrible storms that come through and devastate us, and we name them and we make them aggressive. And I don't think that we have a way to talk about forces larger than us that's built into the sort of normative white Western culture that it really wants to deny that there's lives outside of our own. And I think that making water a character, I don't know that I thought it specifically, but I wanted the relationship with water to not just be about what it does to us, but that it's alive. And other cultures have a really easy time saying that water is alive and fire is alive and forests are alive and mushrooms are alive, and and to talk about More Than Human Beings with the same kind of reverence and complexity that we talk about human characters. So why wouldn't we want to try and figure out how to, even if I'm doing it ham-fistedly and from this culture, to try and figure out how to make some nuances in the way that I talk about destructive forces, right?
Did anything about that process surprise you? The process of building it or learning about how to view water as a person, let's say, did that change the way you view something like water, or shifted your perspective, or did you learn anything that was surprising to you?
Oh, that's really interesting. I think one of the things that I thought I was really being very original in was giving Noni the ability to feel natural forces and feel water especially really deeply. I was like, that's a special quality that I'm giving her. I feel like I identify with it because I love water, but like the extrasensory perception relationship to the natural world, that felt like something that I didn't feel like I was making it up, but I felt like, well, this is novel. And what has surprised me is the conversations I've had with lots of people, especially neurodivergent folks in the years since I've started being out there in the world, of how common that experience is, and how many people feel like they have an excellent sense or an extra sense about water or about storms or about barometric pressure, or all of these things that I feel like Noni's really tapped into. And it was a wonderful proof of concept that, like, of course people can pick up on things that we don't necessarily know how to describe. And it's been really great to have those conversations. That's been a surprise.
Well, and another thing I love about this novel is, and I actually want to preface that, I'm going to be honest.
Yeah.
I would never have picked this up.
You would never have picked this book up.
And the only reason is because, so I'm not a huge dystopian reader.
Yeah. Yep.
For a variety of reasons. You can come at me later, but it's just not something that I've ever been drawn into.
Yeah.
But I really love the idea of it.
Yeah.
And I have friends who love dystopian novels, and they would tell me about it. And from their experiences, I really appreciate what the dystopian novel or the sci-fi novel can do. Because I think we tend to step over them, or we demean the genre, but these genres do so much to push at the contemporary systems, or to commentate on what's going on in any contemporary moment. And I think one of the things that I didn't expect was to, obviously, following along Noni, and there's so much destruction and trauma happening, and I'm feeling like I'm going through it with Noni, but there's also joy. So she also finds joy amid the destruction, and I want to share this scene where, no spoilers, but her and another character on a canoe, they're going through the river, and I think one of them saw a bee. Yeah. And they got so excited, they saw this bee, and the other character said, bees are resurrection.
Yeah.
And Noni says, bees will save us.
Yeah.
And I'm a bee fan anyway, so that helps, but
Spoke to you.
why is it important for you to show a scene like that? And this happens not just in that case, there's multiple moments like this, but that one stood out to me.
Yeah, I mean, for so many reasons, and I think they're wrapped up in that question of who reads dystopias and why, and whether this is a dystopian novel. I mean, it's categorized that way. I get cataloged in sci-fi. I don't have a problem with that, but I wouldn't necessarily describe this, from my heart of hearts, as a dystopian novel, because I think that I was raised by somebody who spent a long time thinking about utopian movements. My father was a craftsman of shaker furniture, and he was obsessed with the Shakers and their complicated relationship to the end of the world and tech and, the postal service and brooms, and gender equality. So I was raised with this whole library full of books on various utopian movements that had come through New England during the 1800s. And one of the things my father said to me is something that I put into the book, which is utopias fail. But I also think dystopias fail. I don't think there's a permanence to either of these things. And I think instead what we have is a lot of communities trying to figure out their very darkest and even their very brightest moments to figure out what we can preserve, what we want to save, and how we want to build something together, and the Shakers included. And so whenever I came back to that notion and thought, well, that's naive, or people really want a dystopia that's all zombies all the time, I would go back to this really beautiful book by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell, where she went through and did this historical research on all of these horrible disaster moments in American and Canadian history. Hurricane Katrina, the earthquake in San Francisco, the exploding ship in Halifax, all of these moments where, the sense we have is, oh, well, it's every person for themselves, and, it's chaos and nobody's going to survive or make it out. And what she found every time is what I think we all sort of know in our bones, which is actually it's mostly stories of people helping each other, creating communities of care, finding ways to get food, finding ways to get shelter and clothing and medical care to the people who are facing this entirely disruptive crisis in their lives. And we see that over and over again. I was in my first stop on my tour for this book was in LA. The book came out the day the Palisades fires started. And I had booked this event in LA and kept saying, I don't have to come. Like, you guys have a lot on your plate. And the bookstore kept saying, no, come. We really need to talk about this moment, and your book does this. And going there and seeing what people were doing, it was places popping up all over the city with wardrobes full of used clothing for people to use, housewares, food pantries. Octavia's Bookshelf, which is a great bookstore there, set up pop-up care facilities for folks. I think that story is more interesting and more true. And it's unfortunate that when we talk about collapse, we often write these books that are about the bleakest version of it, and we don't hold on to the fact that every refugee you've ever talked to, met in person, has something from their journey about how beautiful the flowers were outside their tent, or some really great piece of food they had on the journey, or the way that they fell in love with somebody else on the boat. Like, that's who we are. And when we tell sci-fi stories or dystopian stories from this perspective of it's one zombie after another, I think we lose that. And we lose the potential of saying it doesn't have to be a utopia and it doesn't have to be a dystopia, it's now. The now is what matters, and what we do in the now is so much more about how we treat the stranger, how we treat our neighbors, and building a community based on that as our central principle, as opposed to imagining that there'll be this, friction-free period where it's all chaos and no one makes it out. I don't think those stories are true, and I don't think that they're helpful in the long run.
Well,
Thanks.
I was actually there when the fires happened.
You were?
I was in Altadena. So it was part of the fire, really. And we were at a friend's house, and we must have left minutes before they got the call to evacuate. Because when we were driving away from their house, we saw the fire behind the car. And I'm originally from California, so I'm no stranger to wildfires, unfortunately, but that was a very, very scary moment. And thankfully, their friends are okay. But we also know friends that have lost their homes, but thankfully not their lives. But I did also witness personally the community that came together. And so many thoughts right now, because I have so many questions related to this, because you mentioned Octavia. I want to talk about Octavia Butler real quick,
Goddess.
But there's so much to that, because I think a lot of the stories we hear when disaster strikes is violence. There's looting, there's people stealing things, but oftentimes that's not the case if you're the person who's on those streets witnessing what's happening. And what I really wanted to ask, and perfect segue, because another thing that popped out for me too is this idea of community together, no matter if it's good or bad times, versus the individual person. Because I think this is something that we've also grappled with over the last couple of years.
And we're in it.
Right, and so there's a quote that one of your characters said in the book, and you say, by seeing each other, we see how we're all deeply in charge of each other's welfare. How did you get to that line? I mean, I'm borrowing that from every brilliant thinker that's ever looked at this issue, looked at this problem, that how deeply we are in charge of each other's welfare. I love Thomas Merton's work, and I think about him all the time. There's this quote that he has that I'm gonna just have to paraphrase because I won't get it right, but he talks about being on the street in a big city after being cloistered for a long time, and the way that he is walking through a crowd and every single person is shining like the sun, and that we've lost track of that sometimes. I mean, that connection is inherent in every major world religion. It's what we're supposed to be practicing when we're meditating. It's supposed to be the way that we are thinking about our interconnectedness. And I think you can't be a science writer for more than about 2 minutes without realizing, like, oh, well, the mycorrhizome is connected to the tree, is connected to the salmon, is connected. There's no way to think about the way that we work when you write about nature without thinking about collectivity. And also, again, raised by people who were
interested in utopias, interested in science, and hippies, right? So I was raised, and also I make this joke with my kid all the time that he's fourth generation socialist. Like, it goes way back in my mother's side of the family. This idea that we are in charge of each other doesn't feel novel, but it feels like a novel way to talk about disaster in a sci-fi book. And it's not, because there's Octavia Butler exists, right? And everybody should read everything she's ever written. Ursula Le Guin exists. And I would even say, like, I grew up reading Ray Bradbury. I was obsessed with Ray Bradbury when I was a teenager. And all you have to do is go back to the Martian Chronicles or any of his books to see this sort of meditation on how do we connect with each other. But I wanted to, in a way, if you read the book, it's really a visitation to a bunch of different ways of reorganizing after crisis. Every place that they stop has begun to invent their own new orthodoxy for how to run things in the face of collapse. And some of them work really well and seem like kind, lovely places with a lot of openness and invitation, and some of them seem to work pretty badly and be very devastating and dangerous. Maybe to have started in a good place, but to have like not taken in the deep truth, which is that the more that we respect the stranger as if they are us, the more that we make a safe world for them and for ourselves as well. And every one of the communities that did that, I feel like, was successful in the book. So, you know, a little bit of manipulation there on my part, but yeah.
So, because you're at the part where perhaps the characters found a safe space, or readers have found a safe space. So I want to bring us back to the beginning, where one of your characters said, referencing to what's been going on at the moment, he said he knew this was coming, but couldn't picture it.
Yeah.
So the moment I read that, two people came into my mind, Octavia Butler and George Orwell, 1984. And I have to paraphrase this because we have limited time, but one of the experiences that Octavia Butler, who's an American science fiction writer, if you're not familiar, she shared this experience with an audience of how a student came up to her. And she wrote stories that are very similar to the story that you read before coming today, is he posed this question to Octavia. So do you really believe that in the future we're going to have the kind of trouble you write about in your book? And I'm paraphrasing Octavia's response, but she basically said, you know, I didn't make up those problems.
No.
All I did was I looked around the problems that we're neglecting now, gave them about 30 years to grow into full-fledged problems.
Yeah.
And the student basically challenged her, well, what's the answer? And she said, I don't have one. And he said, do you mean we're just doomed? And she said, no. I mean, there's no single answer that will solve all of our future problems. There's no magic bullet. Instead, there are thousands of answers, at least. You can be one of them if you choose to be.
I love that quote. I think about it all the time.
So, can you imagine I was in crises after reading this very short line? So I think there's this, because I remember a couple of years ago, a lot of people were either reading 1984 for the first time or rereading it. And there's this idea of, oh my gosh, how did he predict a future? So there's this idea of prophetic science fiction writing. But it's not a prediction that came true. No. We've been on this path this whole time.
No.
What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think it's exactly what Margaret Atwood said as well about writing The Handmaid's Tale, which is, I haven't written anything new. All of the things in my book have happened somewhere in history, somewhere on planet Earth. I just happened to put them in this novel, right? Like that idea, and Octavia Butler, I mean, reading The Parable of the Sower, which a lot of people were doing right after the Palisades and Altadena fires, it feels very predictive because there's somebody who resembles our current administration in power. There's wildfires all over California. And I think that when you are somebody who is interested in the political future, which I am, and I am by the training of my childhood, by what I studied in school, by also being a science communicator, I think a lot about what is to come. It is impossible not to try to imagine what would happen if you accelerated the problems 30 years. But it's also, I think, irresponsible to write a future which doesn't resemble the moment. The things that I'm writing about in the book, one of the big strains that I wanted to have was, what does it mean to be a refugee in this world, right? Noni calls them the lost, right? The people who don't have a place or a community that they're going to, or they're between one and another. And there's this moment of realization of like, oh, we're the lost now. And I think that moment is something that we are seeing happening profoundly in this moment in American culture, where we're wondering about how do we treat the stranger. It's even more dystopic than I think most of the dystopias that I spend time reading or writing. That moment of recognizing that the problems are the problems are the problems, and it's just a matter of how much we as a community agree to let them get out of control, and how we agree as a community to rein them back in based on our collective power. I think what happens is not that there's more evil, but that people forget about their collective power. We forget it over and over and over again. We use our collective power to make things change, to make things better, and then they're better, and we rest. And there's nothing wrong with rest, but rest requires additional vigilance to make sure that the collective power that we marshaled to change things last time isn't needed again. And we're in a moment where, whether you're looking at climate change or politics or refugee status or any of the things that we're struggling with, we need our collective power back. And I think every story that we tell that is about the crises that are coming or have arrived for us is really, if you're doing it right, a call to action to be one of the 1,000 answers, because every individual life touches the lives around it most intensely. And I think one of the things I think about a lot too, it's a very hyper-local story. We're just following them where they go. It's not a global story. None of our stories about climate change are global stories. It is a global story, it's happening everywhere, but it's going to be so local for each of us. And I think about the writer Bill McKibben and the way that he talks about, we get asked this when we write about climate change. Anybody who's a science journalist gets asked, what do we do, right? And the answer that I've taken to giving, and I said this in LA when I was talking to that audience of people, some of whom had just been through the fire, was you have to think about your relationship to what's within 50 miles of you, and focus on those neighbors, those ecosystems, those places you want to protect. Being hyper-local like that actually changes things enormously. And people are talking about it in terms of what's been happening in Minnesota in terms of neighborliness, right? Your neighbor relationships matter, and they change things. Being one of 1,000 isn't scary. It just means think about what's right next to you, what's inside of your orbit, and what you can change.
Well, if 1,000 of us did it, that's 1,000 solutions,
That's
right?
1,000 solutions, exactly.
And I mean, you did kind of end that with hope, but I want to continue that strain. We have a couple minutes. I want to leave some time for our audience. I know you have questions, but I think another thing that I saw, or a thread that you and Octavia Butler have shared, is you want to leave hope for the readers, right? For us to go forward. Like, what do we do when we close the book?
Yeah.
We want to feel hopeful, and I think we did. And I do want to share a quote here from Nani before she left the shelter. I'm not going to say where it is placed in the book, but this does happen. But so she just had the experience, and her thought was, if there was light here, there could be light in other places. Yeah. If there was power in me, I could spread it. I could be that power flow and make myself a beacon.
Yeah.
So Noni's gone through some things. Yeah. She's seen some things.
Yeah.
Is this for Noni, the reader, for yourself, or all of the above?
It's for all of the above. I don't think you need to have experienced trauma to be able to be a beacon and a light. I think you need to be able to turn your empathy up and your curiosity up, and the other things that connect you to the people that you've never met before, to imagine their lives. And it's also to be able to bring what's best in you out into the world with as much fearlessness as possible. I think dystopias that teach us to be afraid of each other make us hide that beacon. They make us take down the openness to the stranger, to each other, to the possibility of a future, to the power that we already have in our hands. They make us afraid to go out into the world. And that beacon is the opposite of that. It's the openness that each of us have when we meet each other. And I think we need that more than we ever have at this moment.
So besides disaster movies, what's a beacon for you?
Oh, what's a beacon for me? I mean, my kid, because I really do love Gen Z with like a deep, deep motherly love. I think there's a fantastic group of young people coming up to have interesting ideas. Not to save us, they're not supposed to do that. That's not their damn job. It's a collective, but they are really an interesting group of people. So my kid, I think the future's in really interesting hands, and I don't think it's great that they went through trauma, but I do think that there's a real gift that we've all been given to see the ways in which systems we might have relied upon before are no longer serving any of us. And I think it takes people who've had their minds opened at a really young age sometimes to be able to see that. The other thing is that I go out into nature as often as I possibly can. I like to hike in the Midwest, which seems, I know, to Easterners like a total oxymoron. Like, where are you going? Cornfields? Like, what do you got out there?
That's still nature.
It's still nature. And also, there is a secret. I'm going to give you all a secret. If you ever go to the Midwest, especially if you go to Wisconsin, there is a 1,000-mile trail called the Ice Age Trail that follows the line of the last glaciation of the Midwest that is something that came up during the Carter administration, was invented, and we never hear about it in the East Coast because we only think about the AT or maybe the PCT or something, but we got cool stuff in the Midwest.
I'm seeing a little attitude come out right there.
I know. My husband, who is a very avid hiker, says that the thing that's beautiful about the Midwest is granular beauty. But I think that there's a training there to help you see small things and focus on.
So before we go to questions, I do want to ask, because we started the conversation talking about museums.
Yes.
And how much we love artifacts, preservation, knowledge, memory. Clearly, there's a reason why we're all here tonight. Mm-hmm. What's going through your mind that you're talking about this book sitting in a library filled with readers who love to read?
I mean, first, just like how lucky you are to have this library, this specific library, which is kind of the best of libraries that you could possibly have, in that it feels like it is so open to that essential thing that we need out of libraries, which is a community space that encourages all of us to grow into the best version of ourselves. The resources that are here should be available to every American in every town. And I think it's so lucky to come into a place full of readers who are being nourished by professionals who just want you to have everything you could possibly have in terms of the growth and expansion of your being through books and makerspaces and other fantastic resources. That's one thing. And the other thing is just, I've spent the day with the staff here and in your space and in your town and seeing the Long Island Sound again after many years of not seeing it. And talking about this book, which is a love letter to the people who preserve what's best in us for the future. This is a space that's doing that every day, and it's just such a joy to be in the light of people who believe that that's their mission and their life's work. I do it as a writer, but I think it's beautiful to see all the ways in which that happens across the world and here.
I think we need to give a round of applause to the library.
To the library.
To the library.
And the librarians.
And now you're going to clap for Eiren. So I think now is a good time to open up the floor to questions. And I believe, Jennifer, if you want to give some guidance.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming out. And Eiren and Catherine, I know that we could probably be listening to you for another hour and a half. But if anybody has a question for Eiren, now is the perfect time to ask all those questions that you had while you were reading the book. I am going to ask you to come to this microphone right here so that everyone in the room can hear you, and we are recording, so we will need you here at the microphone.
Hi, Eiren.
Hi.
Your book was amazing. I love dystopian stories, and there was so much depth. And of course, I spent 15 years in New York City and love the museum. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, I'm trying to write a book as well, is, as much as there were little pockets of relief, it was a very, deep and tough book to read. The mother dies, and then the father dies, and then sorry. Sorry.
I tried.
Like there are things that happen.
There's a lot of
really not until the last few pages I felt there was a moment of relief. So how did you think about that? And how did you?
I'm going to tell a story that I've told before, but I think it's really relevant, which is that this book. This is multiple drafts this book took, right? I had 10 years. I wasn't writing it constantly for 10 years, but I was coming back to it. The first draft was twice as long as the book is now. So you can imagine lots of things made it onto the cutting room floor. But in the second draft, maybe, I finally felt brave enough to show it to someone who was a more accomplished, smarter, better writer than me and get her advice. And at that point, no one in the book died, except Mother. I mean, we knew that from the beginning, but there were nothing terrible like that happened through the book. I didn't even really have any weapons in the book. There were no guns in this world that I was making up, because I was like, I don't want to have guns. Anyway, I showed it to this friend of mine, and she read it, and she came to sit down with me to talk about it afterwards. And she looked at me and she said, "You're such a good mother, and you're such a kind one, and you cannot be that to your characters. You have to give them stakes. You have to ruin their lives a little bit." And I told this over dinner, so anybody who is here with me, I'm going to tell it again. Okay, all right. I was really upset by this, and I went to go sit in my office, and my office looked out over a park, and I could see the downtown of Chicago in the distance, and it was sort of the middle of the night, and it was the middle of the winter. And I sat down and I thought, oh, I have to kill this character. And a single firework went up out of nowhere and exploded and died out. And I was like, aw, damn. Okay, all right, I'll do it. It was actually really hard and painful because I love those people, and I tried writing the book in ways where we didn't lose as many people as we do. And there were people that I fought with myself about, like, we're not going to hurt that one. Like, that one stays. But I think it was important because part of what she was getting at and what I was avoiding was the ways in which that kind of trauma was pushing my characters to grow up and come into their maturity and their ownership of what they wanted out of their future. And for them to go through that and still be able to find hope at the end felt essential. And now I can't imagine the book any other way, even though I still hate it. I hate that part. Thank you for that question, and good luck with your book.
Hi.
Hi.
I want to say, first of all, that I'm like Catherine, and I never would have picked up your book, except that you guys at the library did a really good job of selling me on it.
Thank you, Westport Library.
Yeah.
I love you.
Yeah, because I was willing to try.
Great.
And from the minute that I opened it up, I was so captivated by your writing style.
Oh, thank
your
you.
prose is gorgeous. It is absolutely beautiful. I know it says it on the cover, but it's absolutely beautiful. It's true. And it almost makes it hard to read anything else because it's so beautiful.
Thank you.
So that's the main thing I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to, because what I wanted to ask you was just about the Sally ride.
Oh,
Where did that come from?
I mean, I wanted there to
First,
be.
maybe explain what it is.
Yeah, the Sally ride is a trope that's throughout the book, which is a research vessel that Noni's mother was on as a young person, and that we get sort of this imaginary possibility of, like, maybe it's still out there. Maybe even despite the destructions of the ocean and major cities, that there's still scientific work going on, and there's still sort of people trying to put things back together and heal the damage. And Noni holds onto this very tight. For me, it was a late addition to the writing because it was something that I wanted to make concrete, that Noni was imagining a life for herself as an adult and what that would look like and what she would want to do with her future. And I wanted to make sure that I put in what I think is going to be true, which is no matter how difficult the crises of the climate are, even how difficult the crises of politics are, scientists keep working. Like, they keep working. I am in touch with ones that have lost their research positions in the last year, and they're still working and passionately committed to making sure that the things that they are investigating to heal the world are understood and known. And I don't think that would be any different in the kind of world that I'm imagining for Noni to live in. And I wanted to name it after a woman. And I think you can probably tell that because my mother was a hydrogeologist and I grew up around all the scientists that she worked with, that it was important to me to have as many female scientists in the book as I could possibly stuff in there. And so it's a symbol for hope for me. There's still going to be a boat, and it's still going to be named after a pioneering woman. Thank you for that question, and for your lovely comments about the prose.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate, and we all do, your being with us. I have a million questions, but I'll focus my name's Jim Stoner, I live in Westport. I'll focus one on climate change and global unsustainability.
Yeah.
And the basic question will be, what reaction is there so far in the really superb description, I think, well-grounded in science, as to what could be ahead of us? And I'll put it in the context of two of the books that came up as I listened to you.
Yeah.
One is Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Ministry for the Future.
Yes.
And the other one is David Sloan Wilson's book on pro-social.
Yeah.
Both of which I think fit very, very well with what you did. Is there any chance that, I go to a conference on climate change tomorrow.
Oh.
For the weekend.
How fantastic.
And what we can do in business schools and businesses to stop doing the work of the devil.
Yeah.
And start protecting our climate.
Yes. Thank you.
What can you tell me?
Okay, so first, I love Kim Stanley Robinson, and I was just saying to somebody before we came on stage that his book about New York City is probably more accurate to what will happen in climate collapse than mine, in terms of just what the structure of the city might look like and how slowly things might happen. It was incredibly important to me to write a book that my mother would not read and say, that's not how pyroclastic flow works. I really wanted the science to be as grounded as it could be, and I wanted the projections to be within the realm of possibility, if not, absolutely guaranteed to happen. What I end up having these conversations, I actually don't end up talking about the science in groups as much as I end up talking about what we need to do socially in order to survive things. But I often end up recommending a couple of writers to people, not just Kim Stanley Robinson, because his books are brilliant, but also looking at the Rebecca Solnit book and also her book, Hope in the Dark, because I think they're very much about understanding that what's the difference between us surviving climate change and not is community and people and how we work together. But I also feel like it's really important for my mental health to follow Bill McKibben, and his Substack, if anybody's on Substack, is really great for looking at what's happening globally in terms of how much the United States is being outstripped by people working on futures of fuel, futures of electricity, futures of, just travel, sustainability of every type. It's happening, and it's really exciting and encouraging what's happening outside of the United States. So try to be as much of a globalist. That goes for everyone here. Look outside, because there is a lot of hope out there. The other book is, see if I'm gonna get this right, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnston's book, What If We Get It Right, which I think is coming out in paperback very shortly, which is a really practical and kind way of looking at what's happening politically and in more specificity about sustainability and globalization and questions of climate change. And she really does a great job of giving, both of them, I think, solutions, stuff that's really practical. I hope that answers your question. I think when I get invited to talk in places like that, what I get invited to do is to talk about how are we all feeling? But those are really practical folks who are working on the side of things that I think is important.
Thank you.
Yeah, important in that way. Thank you for your question.
My question has to do with two pieces of behavior on the part of Bixie.
Oh, Bixie.
And how they relate to your themes in the book. Mm-hmm. And both of these pieces of behavior initially reminded me of the theme that runs throughout about what makes life life, mm-hmm. and what is truly important is connections to other and caring connections.
Yes.
And that's fundamental to what's important. And both of the incidents that are germane to that theme are complicated by two things you said today.
Yeah.
Each incident to a different theme you mentioned, so that they complicate the question. And the two pieces of behavior had something in common, where Bixie's behavior endangered other people, led to the death of one, and to the near death of two others. And all three were people she loved, who loved her, who cared about her, and more, even more to the point, the well-being of all three of them impacted everybody else who was important to Bixie and to the others in that group. So this was, her behavior had wide-reaching repercussion. And the first one was when they were in the process of escaping, and there was a dog pack that they could hear.
Yep.
Loud barks.
Yep.
And the best thing to do was to go up a tree and shut up.
Right.
And Bixie, whom we had learned already in the book, was given to being overly emotive to the point where she irritated plenty of others. And in this case, her piece of behavior was her usual. She screamed her head off and didn't go up the tree like everybody was saying that's what you need to do. Get up the tree and shut up.
Yeah, yeah.
No, that wasn't what she did. What was the result?
Yeah.
This boy, whom she was
no spoilers.
very fond of, ended up trying to protect her.
I know.
And he was, as a result, the victim of the dog pack.
Yeah. And I think you're probably going to, the second one is going to be the ruin, where they're in the ruin.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I'm going to, so that we don't have any spoilers, because I think these are really important questions, and I will tell you that in early drafts of the book, I had one of my very dearest friends, who I've known for 30 years, who's seen every piece of creative output of my entire life, read the book and say, I hate Bix. Like, I don't, she's so annoying. And I've worked over the drafts to try to mitigate what I think of as the places where Bix makes mistakes or makes judgments that are based out of fear or impulsiveness and aren't necessarily taking in the moment very accurately. One of the reasons that it was important to me that Bix have those vulnerabilities is that I think they're vulnerabilities that we all share in one version or another, which is we get terrified and we make bad judgment calls, and especially in a super dangerous world where did she do everything perfectly? Absolutely not. But also the world is super dangerous and it's going to catch you up even if you step a toe in the wrong direction. And that's not something we can't be in control of it, and also we can't judge ourselves too harshly for the ways in which we're going to make mistakes.
Yes. So the point you made today, one of the points that I thought was germane, was you said, control what you can control.
Yes.
And I assumed that people's ability to do that varies.
Yeah, it does. And I'll say, I think your question is fantastic. And one of the questions that I had early on, I had an interviewer say to me, wow, you really make the men in the book kind of a mess. Like, they're not in charge of anything. And I was like, well, don't say that about those men. I love them, first of all. And second of all, I don't think that it's helpful for us to write books where one gender or one character or one person gets it right all the time. And I don't think it's fair to men, frankly, to make them have to be the superheroes that come in and always know where the boat is, and like they've got the map. And I don't think it's fair to make women into that position either. I think it's important for us to try and write characters that feel like they're going to be just as messed up as the people that you know. Like, if I imagine my little family trying to survive, kind of a disaster. Like, sometimes we can't remember to take the garbage out. Like, you know, some of us are loud. Like, everybody's got food preferences. I don't know how we do it. And I wanted it to be not somebody that, my best friend would say, I hate that character, but to be someone who felt like, yeah, her impulsivity is her impulsivity. And it's going to stand her in good steads in certain circumstances, but in some it's going to be really dangerous.
And the piece of behavior that occurred at the ruin, which was her usual impulse to delve into anything that looked interesting, no matter whether she should, if she stopped 2 seconds to consider.
Yeah.
And what that connected to something else you said today, which was, we want to preserve openness. So what's the balance there?
We want to preserve, I'm sorry, what was the word? Openness.
But she exercised no judgment at all about whether this was an appropriate occasion for her to...
Totally understandable. I think that the thing is that I value curiosity enormously, and so even if curiosity can sometimes be, the flip side can be danger, I think it's still worth investing in as a characteristic. And I think there are places where throughout the narrative, Bix's curiosity saves them in ways that are important too. So.
Do you think when we're reading characters, we forget that they're not perfect, so we get really annoyed? Is it too real?
Yeah.
That's why we're like, oh my God.
What are they doing? Why did you do it like that? Yeah, I think that's common for me as a reader.
Hi. I came up from Greenwich, so I can really congratulate you all on this beautiful library and this wonderful program. I really enjoyed the book, and I wanted to ask you, I felt that there was a lesson or a message in the evolution of this group, in that at the beginning, so I'm only commenting on the very beginning, but this wonderful group doing this amazing labor to decide how to preserve what was important to humanity also was a group that chose to exclude the lost. And a very definite decision. It wasn't inadvertent. It was done with locks and keys. And they were able to rationalize that for themselves as protecting each other, protecting the children. But they did make a decision to exclude other desperate people. And I felt that communities that they encounter, once they've become the lost, they saw different attributes in each community, but that the communities that in the end, or through the story, they saw that, perhaps, it's wonderful to preserve the fossils but the important thing was preserving each other and helping each other. And I wonder if that was an intentional evolution, that you were kind of showing their growth as a tiny community, once the excluders feeling the importance of being included.
Absolutely, that's exactly right, yes. It was really important to me, and again, the same way that writing Bix needed to be complicated, I wanted to make sure that we understood that this, although their project was incredibly important and we root for them and we love them and we see why they've chosen this, that there is really questionable morality at the center of some of the way that they're organizing themselves. And that's true across many really wonderful communities that we create all the time. And it's even true about museums, which I revere and love. You can't really tell the story about museums without saying, there are lots of people who stole things that they didn't have any right to, and imprisoned objects and memories that they had no right to. And I still love the museum. And I love these people very much, but I need to be able to see them whole and entire, and I need to give them the chance to grow and mature and understand that, adage that I love to think about all the time, which is when you have more than you need, you make a bigger table, not a bigger wall, right? I love that where we find them at the end is making that table bigger and inviting people and welcoming the stranger, because in some deep, visceral way, they've recognized that their safety lies in the invitation to the larger community. And I wanted to leave us there because I truly believe that that's where we need to go as an evolution culturally as well. We need that message, and we need to be able to envision not just, is this a wonderful place that I've made for myself and my family, but how can I recognize that I'm leaving people out, right? And how can I invite them in? Thank you.
Eiren, thank you so much for this fabulous book and for coming all the way to Westport to share it with us. Thank you all for having read our Westport Reads, or are trying to read our Westport Reads selection. I hope we'll see you again next year at next year's Westport Reads keynote conversation. I do want to say that we not only have copies of All the Water in the World, so you could take it home with you, but we also have copies of The Mourner's Bestiary, Eiren's first book. So if you want to read this one as well, she will be signing. And I hope we'll see you in libraries across Connecticut or wherever you're from, reading just as many books. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Coming.
Thank you, Westport Library. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone. It was an honor. Thank you, Catherine.